This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Respectonomics is bringing you an edition of Living Economics, and the title to this is The Economics of Gambling. My name is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am your voice of economics. I'm your year of Respectonomics, welcoming at any time your comments and feedback that you would like to offer. The email is jeremy@respectonomics.com. jeremy@respectonomics.com. And this title of The Economics of Gambling has a sort of surprising issue with it because we're not actually talking about whether one should go out and gamble and make money, because the economist knows it doesn't work. What we're talking about is the subject of economics itself as a gamble. And I'd like to start us off with a description of economics and to see whether or not this fits into your personal profile and your paradigm. The first point is that economics is considered to be what's called a social science. I have a great deal of difficulty with that expression because science is evidence-based. It deals with the laws of physics. It deals with mathematical relationships between one product and another, one element and another. And in order to bring social life into a scientific model raises one important question. How do you synthesize the human being? The human being is reflexive, responsive, unpredictable, changes his mind or her mind, and enjoys looking at things one day and for some bizarre reason the next morning does not. We are fickle. And what I mean by all this discussion is that economics seems to think that it can confine the habits of a human being into some kind of formulaic equation, and their answer is it cannot be done. Give you an example. The child that eats Rice Krispies every morning, one morning looks up and says, I don't want Rice Krispies anymore. No rhyme, no reason, change of mind. And that kind of flexibility, that kind of responsiveness, the reflex kind of approach, that means, in other words, that trying to systemize or synthesize human behavior is full of risk. There's a couple of so-called jokes that are made about economists. One is, if you took 10 economists and put them in one room, you would never get one opinion. The other one that was by Peter Lynch, reportedly, Peter Lynch was the iconic asset manager with the Fidelity organization, and he was the one who said, find the finest economist you can, the finest, and consult with that individual for 15 minutes, and you'll have just wasted 15 minutes of your life. There's different ways of looking at this, but the reason this is so important to understand the risks of taking economics as being something that is articulate, that is forensic, and is powerful, is full of potential errors. We've talked already about the risk of it synthesizing human behavior. We also bring to another point that economics is sometimes called a dismal science. And that was an expression that was Thomas Carlyle invented back in the 1850s. But the problem with that expression, dismal science is not dismal. Science is beautiful. Science has all kinds of attributes to it that have enabled us to make enormous advances in our process of civilization. So I don't think we should ever refer to science as dismal. And there again, we've got economics being decided to being called a social science, and then we've also got it now being called a dismal science, and both are unfitting and unsuitable. So With this in mind, we need to look at economics and understand more about it and how it intercedes with our lives. The finest economist that you will ever find is the farmer. The farmer is operating independently, has to base all of the expectations of what he or she is going to be growing and planting and harvesting and so on, is based on all kinds of different inputs, including experience and including intuition. Generally speaking, the farmer does not gamble, he invests. And the key point behind this is that he is using forensic information, empirical information, to decide which crop she will be producing. And the point of the matter is that it's something that he will be extremely open about. If you go to a farmer's field, love it or leave it, you will see growing corn or beans or barley, but you will see it. It's very open sesame. It's very open to view. Economics in so many corridors is secretive. It's hidden. It's discreet. It doesn't tell you everything. And one of the problems that we as members of an economy live with today is the principle that we are being gaslighted. Gaslighting in the sense that we are made to feel that we don't know what we want to know, that we are possibly even stupid, and it's a psychological dilemma. Here is the dilemma, because we are told one thing at the proverbial economic level that in our day-to-day living just isn't true. Classically, the rate of inflation is cited as being 3.156%. It's got some bizarre set of decimals to follow it. So how come our Visa bill or our MasterCard bill is up by 20, 30, 40% from a year ago based on just normal, conventional, traditional spending? In other words, we know in our hearts that the rate of inflation is much higher. We know that the figures are being, at best, manipulated, and we know that we're not hearing the truth. We are, in other words, being gaslighted. And here's the problem with economics. Economics should be a very useful tool. It should be the one that would explain the combinations of stimulus and response. Prices go up, what are people going to do with that? And so on. Is the demand elastic or is it inelastic? Do people want to consume more or do they want to consume less? There are some very valid questions that can be discussed and put into this economic matrix. No difficulty with that. The snag is that economic paradigms have become almost a religion. They've become a sort of biblical proportion. And you hear political leaders talking about our economic insights tell us A, B, and C. Economics is brilliant at telling you what's happened in the past. It ain't so good at forecasting. And how many times have you seen a government introducing new measures that have two characteristics to them? One is they don't work, and secondly, you were never consulted. Economics, in its very nature, it's from the Greek. It means, from the Greek, oikos and nemos, or nemine. What it means is to manage the household. Oikos is the house, nemine is the management. To manage the household. And if you're managing a household, you tend to think in terms of full disclosure. You tend to say things like, if you're managing your own household, you'd say, let's go on such and such a trip. Somebody says, what about that trip? And you say, we can't afford it. You have just provided full economic input. But we are full of letting it be known. We are full of disclosure. We find that in the political arena, a lot of the so-called economic decisions are concealed. We don't hear the real truth. And what's worse is the politician accepts economic inputs as the be-all and the end-all, when in actual fact, instead of being used as a tool, it is being used as a weapon. So we've got a situation where we're trying to synthesize human behavior. We've taken it to a model whereby we see economics being used to control us. Now, you may get very upset at the word control because the human being is designed to have freedom of choice. Let's be very explicit about that. But the snag is that when you feel that you are being suppressed or repressed, it is then that you feel that you don't have the ability to be included in the conversation. It's when you feel that you don't have the ability to innovate. Therein is one of the greatest problems with control. When we are controlled, we lose the ability to bring in new ideas, to be innovative, to be more productive. It's a stalling device. It's an act of suppression. And then you may say, well, how do we get controlled by economics? We get controlled by economics because governments on a worldwide basis now are engaged in full-scale fiscal expansion without having the resources to pay for these things. So if you've got fiscal expansion, which means that you're spending money like it's whatever, you're spending all kinds of money and you don't have the resources to do it, you're borrowing the money. It's called a deficit. And when these deficits are exploding and rising all the time, they are forming part of the economic framework. And it's a framework that is suppressive because if a country is in debt, then by definition, the players in that country are the ones who are going to be picking up the debt and paying for it. And therefore, you are under control. More deficits, more control, more control, more deficits. It's a vortex in reverse, and it's building into our lives all the time. Here's the next problem, though. These extraordinary fiscal expenditures, this money that's being spent by governments, is basically a gamble. Let's talk about a gamble. A gamble is not something that has a definitive answer. When you invest, like the farmer invests, of course the farmer can get it wrong. We can all get it wrong. But at least there's a discipline and there's a process and an understanding of the intended inputs and the intended outcomes. So often we hear these gargantuan figures being given out. We're going to build a pipeline and this will employ 30,000 people. And there is absolutely no empirical evidence to support that. But because we're in a place where we are being controlled, where we are being suppressed, our ability to innovate, our ability to introduce new ideas is limited, and therefore you just become an accepting member of that community, and you are at the gambling table. And I say you're at the gambling table because when the gambling is being taken place by the government, don't misunderstand one point. The gamble will be paid for by the people. Now, here's the next problem with gambling. Addictive gambling, which is what the government is engaged in, and so are we to a point as the constituents. But when you have addictive gambling, there are two things that happen. Number one, it is the size of the wagers, the size of the bets gets bigger every time because the next one is going to be the one that's going to solve everything. Secondly, the gambling is based on the premise or the thought, the addiction is premised on somebody will bail me out. And governments are always looking to be bailed out by you and me. So not only are they taking these gargantuan gambles, for which there is no empirical evidence that they will work, but we will be the ones to pick up the pieces. Let me just remind each other of one thing. If you go to Vegas, Vegas has one denominator, and that is the house always wins. There may be people who come away with winnings, there'll be many a person who comes away with disasters, but the house always wins. And the house is the government, and the government knows that. So their gambling metric and their authorization comes from this economic model. I want to summarize one other thing about economics, and that is we can come up with all these clever words and descriptions. We can talk about things like balance of payments and interest rate forecasts and so on. How many of these have ever been proven to be accurate? How many times have you heard an economist say such and then explain 6 weeks later, well, actually the information has changed? You only have to look at the government statistics on unemployment. They say the figure is ABC. 6 months later, it's been revised upwards or downwards. So the input information is not reliable, the analysis is not reliable, and the overall intent is probably to gaslight the population so that they can get away with whatever they're trying to do at the time. I want to put one nasty one in front of us all, though, and that is economics, like a lot of subjects in life, can be called I'll put it into less vernacular than's probably appropriate in most people's lives, but we would say economics is a crock of poo. That's a polite way of saying it, isn't it? But that actually introduces that metaphor, introduces two important points. The first one is the contents described in that manner are by definition toxic. And economics has become toxic because it's forcing us into paradigms, into formulas, equations that literally do not make sense. And I want to put one more thought on it. And that is, if we go to this paradigm, this metaphor again of the crock of poo, you would also say to me quite correctly, that is disgusting. I think I'm going to stop on that particular point and say, if it's disgusting and if it's also toxic, would we not want to avoid it? Therefore, we should avoid economics as a subject. We've seen senior recognized individuals talking about the fragility, the weaknesses of economics. We know that there are many people with proverbially PhDs from many different universities studying the formula and the connections on human behavior. But I think we should always come back to one point. The human being is a free agent, and the human being is a bit like that coin that you flip it 100 times and then you say on the 101st time it will come up heads or tails. You do not know that. I do not know, and we do not know what the weather forecast is going to be in a few weeks' time. We don't even know our own personal forecasts. Most of us, if we were asked, what are you going to do today, would come back with answers like, well, I'm going to the office, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I'm there. I'm not sure what I'm going to do when I get back. And I'm not even going to be sure where I'll be doing what I did yesterday. So we have this sort of miasma of not being fully cognizant of what we're doing. And at the same time, the economist says, yes, you do know what you're doing. No, a lot of our behavior would be considered, roughly speaking, irrational. It might be intemperate. It might be impetuous. And I think there's a lot of buying and selling decisions we make that we can't really, in an articulate, methodical way, explain. I'm not saying that's a complaint. As a matter of fact, I'm saying it's the beauty of the human being, that the human being has this freedom of choice, this freedom to explore, to innovate, and to do different things. And so long as we're under this suppression of the economics of gambling, then that suppression will translate into a sense of being unable to perform at the level to the potential for which we were created. This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am, again, your voice of Respectonomics and your year. I'd love to hear back from you. We call this living economics. And I think we have to be very certain that in the rollout that we talk about, we want to make sure that economics is a living and vital tool that we can use to our advantage. In some circles, it would be better to call living economics dying economics because it is one that brings as an end. It's where the host, the country, can no longer survive as it is sucked by deficits and incompetence and inappropriate connections made under the heading of economics. Let's take a more cynical view of economics. Let's take it back to its Greek origins of household management and recognize that you and I are in the business of household management, which many of us do very well. If we're having household management, we can talk about it. And that is the one thing Respectonomics offers, Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley offers, and that is presentations and workshops, consultations, speeches, and so on, because we need to get this word out so that we can be the new light. We can be the ones that come back to the table and say, we have a way of coordinating people to produce more capital goods, more consumption, more propensity to consume, more satisfaction. All these big words we can do when we have the freedom so to do. Suppression doesn't work, and economics in its current formula is a very dangerous formula. On this, I rest my case. In so doing, I thank you so much for listening.